Tekken 1, the first Tekken game ever made. The Tekken game that gave birth to the Tekken franchise, which now has about 500 trillion different games. And the thing is, for the most part, most Tekken games are pretty quality games. Some of them are actually really good fighting games. The first Tekken, it had a lot of kinks to work out. It was not the best fighting game ever made, but it did break the glass ceiling in a lot of aspects. It did something Hillary Clinton couldn't. It broke the glass ceiling. For one thing, it's a 3D fighting game in 1995, which is impressive on its own. It also has a good amount of characters for 1995, and while it is 3D, you would think a 3D fighting game in 1995 would have like square characters, like they wouldn't be rounded off, but the graphics are actually pretty good. They're not just a bunch of squares, like a square body, two square sticks for legs, two square sticks for arms, and little twigs for fingers, and then a square box for a head. The characters actually look good. I mean, it has amazing graphics for 1995. The handling and the actual fighting, that's where the game is not that impressive, and that's pretty much the most important thing in the game. The characters are a bit cumbersome to move around. It feels like Tekken characters from like a good Tekken game who just woke up. They're not as agile. The jumps feel strained. The movement is a little slow. And there's not a huge amount of strategy. I mean, there's different types of attacks that you can perform. A lot of the powerful attacks are a little too powerful. Like any kind of attack that moves you forward and hits, it has a really long range, but it also does a lot of damage. So these attacks, the attacks that propel you and hit at the same time, these are the ones that you can spam and pretty much defeat everyone, even on like the hardest of difficulties. You could also beat enemies by being cheap, like ducking and hitting the legs over and over. Aside from the combat, the CPUs in the game also aren't that smart. But on the hardest difficulty, they themselves can be cheap. They can spam really powerful attacks and pretty much destroy you without any effort. While the game's graphical capabilities are very impressive for 1995, its AI and its actual fighting mechanics aren't really anything special. I can compare it to a couple of other fighting games I reviewed in the past and just give you a little rundown of how good this game really is. Let's compare it to something that's very similar, and that's the first Virtua Fighter game, a game I reviewed about 4 years ago. It's very similar in terms of combat and the way the characters move, i.e. very stiff, but it's also very similar in terms of the graphics. The only difference is this is for the PlayStation 1 and Virtua Fighter was for the 32X, the one that I reviewed. So the graphics in this one are just a lot better. It's exactly what I actually talked about in the beginning, where the character models are basically a collection of square boxes. That's what the Virtua Fighter characters look like, at least compared to the Tekken 1 characters. The thing is, even though the graphics are objectively much better in Tekken 1 than Virtua Fighter 1, it's understandable and it's not that impressive simply because the PlayStation is just more technically advanced than the Sega 32X, even despite the fact that they are both 32-bit consoles. I actually think while the combat, though, is pretty similar, the actual combat in the Virtua Fighter game is a little less stiff, and it's actually a little more fun to play because of that. So even though this game beats out Virtua Fighter in the graphics, I think Virtua Fighter's combat overall is slightly better, which definitely makes it a little bit better than the first Tekken game. Now, the second fighting game I want to compare to Tekken 1 is Dragon the Bruce Lee Story. This is a 2D fighting game for the Sega Genesis, and it's also a game that has good graphics, much like this one, but suffers from combat that isn't the best. The thing is, in Dragon, the combat wasn't technically bad or mediocre because the characters were stiff or because they were slow, just because they didn't move as well as they should in better fighting games. It's actually the exact opposite. In Dragon, the characters were very lively, very agile. When you played as Bruce Lee, he flipped all around the screen. He did these somersaults. He was kicking everyone's ass. The thing is, in that game, there was almost one game-breaking move, which basically meant you didn't have to use anything other than this move. And there was this weird somersault attack. He would like get on his like back almost and push himself with his arms and also propelling himself forward with his legs toward the enemy with both his legs. And these attacks were really hard to block. And also, while this was an attack, a somersault attack, it was also a way to get out of the way of enemy attacks because you were constantly moving and flying through the air, somersaulting. So you were basically, while you were in the air doing these somersaults, a missile that couldn't be touched. It was basically all about spamming this attack over and over, somersaulting chefs, somersaulting soldiers in an some kind of weird military base dance right in the face over and over. In that game, you didn't have to use any kind of strategy. This game is a little better in terms of strategy. Even though it's a little stiffer in the combat, you still can do strategy. You can do combinations in Tekken 1. I think overall, Tekken would be a little bit better than Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, mostly because while it is stiff, it's still a lot richer in the meat and potatoes of a fighting game, the combat. Dragon Bruce Lee story also had such a corny, stupid story from what I remember. Like, the story in the game was basically Bruce Lee walking on screen and some guy's like, "Hey, I want to fight you." And Bruce Lee's like, "Why do you want to fight me? I'm just a peaceful martial artist walking with his shirt off. What's the problem here?" It's like Bruce Lee would be in a restaurant in that game and the chef would be like, "Hey you, I'll kick your ass." Like, Bruce Lee can't go anywhere without people constantly challenging him to a fight. The man is trying to enjoy his dinner and he's being attacked by a machete-wielding chef. It's like that scene from Dumb and Dumber when they're having pasta and the chef runs out trying to fight him. Except the difference is that movie was a comedy and Dragon the Bruce Lee story is not being ironic. The third and final game I want to compare to Tekken 1 would be Justice League Task Force. Another 2D fighting game, kind of in the style of Street Fighter 2 almost. Even though it was kind of a mixture of Street Fighter 2 and Marvel vs. Capcom, just because you get to fight as all these superheroes. Now, the game, much like Tekken, had great graphics. Even though it was 2D, the models in that game looked amazing. I mean, especially Wonder Woman. Man, look at that body. Why can't Wonder Woman look like this in the Wonder Woman movies? I'm not saying Gal Gadot is like ugly. She's beautiful. She's like a 9 out of 10. But the Wonder Woman in this game, she's like a perfect 10. Look at that. While the game looked great, it also handled pretty well. It handled a lot better than Tekken. It wasn't stiff at all. You could move great, and you had a lot of special attacks in that game. So I think in terms of the meat and potatoes of a fighting game, the fighting, that game kind of beats out Tekken. The thing is, it was very bland fighting for the most part. It wasn't like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter 2. Most of the attacks weren't impressive. But then again, most of the attacks in Tekken 1 aren't really that impressive. It's very much vanilla, plain mashed potatoes without gravy fighting. I did have a problem in that game with the type of superheroes that fought each other. Like, if Superman and Batman fought each other just without any kind of suit, even with a super powerful suit that Batman was wearing, Superman would still murder him with like one punch. Like, you have the Green Arrow, whatever the guy's name is, fighting Superman. These are all people Superman would literally murder with one punch. He would punch a hole through the chest of every other character in Justice League Task Force, minus maybe Wonder Woman, with ease. So the fact that he's fighting them all doesn't make any sense. There was no kind of backstory like Batman put a kryptonite tampon up his butt before he started fighting Superman. They were just like fighting each other. And for some reason, Batman and the Green Arrow were holding their own versus a man who is completely invulnerable to pretty much anything physical. I think despite its faults though, Justice League Task Force is still a little better than Tekken 1. Both the games have great graphics, but Justice League Task Force kind of ekes out because the characters also move well. There's no stiffness, like the stiffness in my pants when I watch Wonder Woman in this game. Overall, Tekken was an impressive introduction into the Tekken series. It had a lot of faults and kinks to work out, but it was a good beta version of the Tekken games that were to come. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more classic game reviews. Goodbye, my friends.